I didn't sit on the wall myself because it was damp and crumbling, and because I thought someone might appear any minute and shout at us for sitting there. But Ruth did sit on it, knees on either side like she was astride a horse. And today I have these vivid images of the 10-15 minutes we waited there. No one's talking about the possible anymore. We're pretending instead that we're just killing a bit of time, maybe at a scenic spot during a carefree day trip. Rodney's doing a little dance to demonstrate what a good feeling there is. He gets up on the wall, balances along it, then deliberately falls off. Tommy's making jokes about some passers-by, and though they're not very funny, we're all laughing. Just Ruth in the middle astride the wall remains silent. She keeps the smile on her face, but hardly moves. There's a breeze messing up her hair, and the bright winter sun's making her crinkle up her eyes, so you're not sure if she's smiling at our antics or just grimacing in the light. These are the pictures I've kept of those moments we waited by that car park. I suppose we were waiting for Ruth to decide when it was time to go back for a second look. Well, she never got to make that decision because of what happened next. Tommy, who had been mucking about on the wall with Rodney, suddenly jumped down and went still. Then he said, "That's her. That's the same one." We all stopped what we were doing and watched the figure coming from the direction of the office. She was now wearing a cream-colored overcoat and struggling to fasten her briefcase as she walked. The buckle was giving her trouble, so she kept slowing down and starting again. We went on watching her in a kind of trance as she went past on the other side. Then, as she was turning into the high street, Ruth leapt up and said, "Let's see where she goes." We came out of our trance and were off after her. In fact, Chrissy had to remind us to slow down or someone would think we were a gang of muggers going after the woman. We followed along the high street at a reasonable distance, giggling, dodging past people, separating and coming together again. It must have been around 2 o'clock by then, and the pavement was busy with shoppers. At times we nearly lost sight of her, but we kept up loitering in front of window displays when she went into a shop, squeezing past pushchairs and old people when she came out again. Then the woman turned off the high street into the little lanes near the seafront. Chrissy was worried she'd notice us away from the crowds, but Ruth just kept going and we followed behind her. Eventually we came into a narrow side street that had the occasional shop but was mainly just ordinary houses. We had to walk again in single file, and once, when a van came the other way, we had to press ourselves into the houses to let it pass. Before long there was only the woman and us in the entire street, and if she'd glanced back there was no way she wouldn't have noticed us. But she just kept walking a dozen or so steps ahead, then went in through a door into the Portway Studios. I've been back to the Portway Studios a number of times since then. It changed owners a few years ago and now sells all kinds of arty things: pots, plates, clay, animals. Back then it was 2 big white rooms, just with paintings beautifully displayed with plenty of spaces between them. The wooden sign hanging over the door is still the same one though. Anyway, we decided to go in after Rodney pointed out how suspicious we looked in that quiet little street. Inside the shop we could at least pretend we were looking at the pictures. We came in to find the woman we'd been following talking to a much older woman with silver hair who seemed to be in charge of the place. They were sitting on either side of a small desk near the door, and apart from them the gallery was empty. Neither woman paid much attention as we filed past, spread out, and tried to look fascinated by the pictures. Actually preoccupied though I was with Ruth's possible, I did begin to enjoy the paintings and the sheer peacefulness of the place. It felt like we'd come 100 miles from the high street. The walls and ceilings were peppermint, and here and there you'd see a bit of fishing net or a rotted piece from a boat stuck up high near the cornicing. The paintings, too, mostly oils in deep blues and greens, had sea themes. Maybe it was the tiredness suddenly catching up with these after all we'd been traveling since before dawn, but I wasn't the only one who went off into a bit of a dream in there. We'd all wandered into different corners and were staring at one picture after another, only occasionally making the odd, hushed remark like, "Come and look at this." All the time we could hear Ruth's possible and the silver-haired lady talking on and on. They weren't especially loud, but in that place their voices seemed to fill the entire space. They were discussing some man they both knew how he didn't have a clue with his children. And as we kept listening to them stealing the odd glance in their direction bit by bit, something started to change. It did for me, and I could tell it was happening for the others. If we'd left it at seeing the woman through the glass of her office, even if we'd followed her through the town then lost her, we could still have gone back to the cottages excited and triumphant. But now in that gallery the woman was too close, much closer than we'd ever really wanted. And the more we heard her and looked at her, the less she seemed like Ruth. It was a feeling that grew among us almost tangibly, and I could tell that Ruth, absorbed in a picture on the other side of the room, was feeling it as much as anyone. That was probably why we went on shuffling around that gallery for so long. We were delaying the moment when we'd have to confer. Then suddenly the woman had left, and we all kept standing about, avoiding each other's eyes. But none of us had thought to follow the woman, and as the seconds kept ticking on, it became like we were agreeing, without speaking, about how we now saw the situation. Eventually the silver-haired lady came out from behind her desk and said to Tommy, who was the nearest to her, "That's a particularly lovely work. That one's a favorite of mine." Tommy turned to her and let out a laugh. Then, as I was hurrying over to help him out, the lady asked, "Are you art students?" "Not exactly," I said before Tommy could respond. "We're just well keen." The silver-haired lady beamed, then started to tell us how the artist whose work we were looking at was related to her, and all about the artist's career thus far. This had the effect, at least, of breaking the trance-like state we'd been in, and we gathered round her to listen the way we might have done at Hailsham when a guardian started to speak. This really got the silver-haired lady going, and we kept nodding and exclaiming while she talked about where the paintings had been done, the times of day the artist liked to work, how some had been done without sketches. Then there came a kind of natural end to her lecture, and we all gave a sigh, thanked her, and went out. The street outside being so narrow we couldn't talk properly for a while longer, and I think we were all grateful for that. As we walked away from the gallery in single file, I could see Rodney up at the front, theatrically stretching out his arms like he was exhilarated the way he'd been when we'd first arrived in the town. But it wasn't convincing, and once we came out onto a wider street, we all shuffled to a halt. We were once again near a cliff edge. And like before, if you peered over the rail you could see the paths zigzagging down to the seafront, except this time you could see the promenade at the bottom with rows of boarded-up stalls. We spent a few moments just looking out, letting the wind hit us. Rodney was still trying to be cheerful, like he'd decided not to let any of this business spoil a good outing. He was pointing out to Chrissy something in the seaway off on the horizon. But Chrissy turned away from him and said, "Well, I think we're agreed, aren't we?" "That isn't Ruth." She gave a small laugh and laid a hand on Ruth's shoulder. "I'm sorry. We're all sorry. But we can't blame Rodney, really. It wasn't that wild a try. You've got to admit, when we saw her through those windows, it did look—" She trailed off, then touched Ruth on the shoulder again. Ruth said nothing but gave a little shrug, almost as if to shrug off the touch. She was squinting into the distance at the sky rather than the water. I could tell she was upset, but someone who didn't know her well might well have supposed she was being thoughtful. "Sorry, Ruth," Rodney said, and he too gave Ruth a pat on the shoulder. But he had a smile on his face, like he didn't expect for one moment to be blamed for anything. It was the way someone apologized when they'd tried to do you a favor but it hadn't worked out. Watching Chrissy and Rodney at that moment, I remember thinking, yes, they were okay. They were kind in their way, and were trying to cheer Ruth up. At the same time, though, I remember feeling, even though they were the ones doing the talking and Tommy and I were silent, a sort of resentment towards them on Ruth's behalf. Because however sympathetic they were, I could see that deep down they were relieved. They were relieved things had turned out the way they had, that they were in a position to comfort Ruth instead of being left behind in the wake of a dizzying boost to her hopes. They were relieved they wouldn't have to face more starkly than ever the notion which fascinated and nagged and scared them, this notion of theirs that there were all kinds of possibilities open to us Hailsham students that weren't open to them. I remember thinking then how different they actually were, Chrissy and Rodney, from the three of us. Then Tommy said, I don't see what difference it makes. It was just a bit of fun we were having. A bit of fun for you, maybe, Tommy, Ruth said coldly, still gazing straight ahead of her. You wouldn't think so if it was your possible we'd been looking for. I think I would, Tommy said. I don't see how it matters. Even if you found your possible, the actual model they got you from. Even then, I don't see what difference it makes to anything. Thank you for your profound contribution, Tommy, said Ruth. But I think Tommy's right, I said. It's daft to assume you'll have the same sort of life as your model. I agree with Tommy. It's just a bit of fun. We shouldn't get so serious about it. I too reached out and touched Ruth on the shoulder. I wanted her to feel the contrast to when Chrissy and Rodney had touched her, and I deliberately chose exactly the same spot. I expected some response, some signal that she accepted understanding from me and Tommy in a way she didn't from the veterans. But she gave me nothing, not even the shrug she'd given Chrissy. Somewhere behind me I could hear Rodney pacing about, making noises to suggest he was getting chilly in the strong wind. How about going to visit Martin now? He said. His flat's just over there behind those houses. Ruth suddenly sighed and turned to us. To be honest, she said, I knew all along it was stupid. Yes, said Tommy eagerly. Just a bit of fun. Ruth gave him an irritated look. Tommy, please shut up with all this bit of fun stuff. No one's listening. Then turning to Chrissy and Rodney, she went on, I didn't want to say when you first told me about this. But look, it was never on. They don't ever use people like that woman. Think about it. Why would she want to? We all know it, so why don't we all face it? We're not modeled from that sort, Ruth, I cut in firmly. Ruth, don't. But she just carried on, we all know it. We're modeled from trash. Junkies, prostitutes, winos, tramps. Convicts, maybe, just so long as they aren't psychos. That's what we come from. We all know it, so why don't we say it? A woman like that? Come on. Yeah, right, Tommy. A bit of fun. Let's have a bit of fun pretending. That other woman in there, her friend, the old one in the gallery. Art students, that's what she thought we were. Do you think she'd have talked to us like that if she'd known what we really were? What do you think she'd have said if we'd asked her? Excuse me, but do you think your friend was ever a clone model? She'd have thrown us out. We know it, so we might as well just say it. If you want to look for possibles, if you want to do it properly, then you look in the gutter. You look in rubbish bins. Look down the toilet, that's where you'll find where we all came from. Ruth Rodney's voice was steady and had a warning in it. Let's forget about it and go and see Martin. He's off this afternoon. You'll like him, he's a real laugh. Chrissy put an arm around Ruth. Come on, Ruth. Let's do what Rodney says. Ruth got to her feet and Rodney started to walk. Well, you lot can go, I said quietly. I'm not going. Ruth turned and looked at me carefully. Well, what do you know? Who's the upset one now? I'm not upset. But sometimes you speak garbage, Ruth. Oh, look who's upset now. Poor Kathy. She never likes straight talking. It's nothing to do with that. I don't want to visit a carer. We're not supposed to, and I don't even know this guy. Ruth shrugged and exchanged glances with Chrissy. Well, she said, there's no reason we've got to go round together the whole time. If little miss here doesn't want to join us, she doesn't have to. Let her go off by herself. Then she leaned over to Chrissy and said in a stage whisper, that's always the best way when Kathy's in a mood. Leave her alone and she'll walk it off. Be back at the car by 4 o'clock, Rodney said to me. Otherwise you'll have to hitchhike. Then he did a laugh. Come on, Kathy, don't get in a sulk. Come with us. No. You go on. I don't feel like it. Rodney shrugged and started to move off again. Ruth and Chrissy followed, but Tommy didn't move. Only when Ruth stared at him did he say, I'll stay with Kath. If we're splitting, then I'll stay with Kath. Ruth glared at him in fury, then turned and strode off. Chrissy and Rodney looked at Tommy awkwardly, then they too began walking again. Chapter 15. Tommy and I leaned on the rail and stared at the view until the others had gone out of sight. It's just talk, he said eventually. Then after a pause, it's just what people say when they're feeling sorry for themselves. It's just talk. The Guardians never told us anything like that. I started to walk the opposite way to the others and let Tommy fall and step beside me. It's not worth getting upset about, Tommy went on. Ruth's always doing things like that now. It's just her letting off steam. Anyway, like we were telling her, even if it's true, even a little bit true, I don't see how it makes any difference. Our models, what they were like, that's nothing to do with us, Kath. It's just not worth getting upset about. Okay, I said, and deliberately bumped my shoulder into his. Okay. I had the impression we were walking towards the town center, though I couldn't be sure. I was trying to think of a way to change the subject when Tommy said, first, when we were in that Woolworth's place earlier? When you were down at the back with the others. I was trying to find something. Something for you. A present? I looked at him in surprise. I'm not sure Ruth would approve of that. Not unless you got her a bigger one. A sort of present. But I couldn't find it. I wasn't going to tell you, but now, well, I've got another chance to find it. Except you might have to help me. I'm not very good at shopping. Tommy, what are you talking about? You want to get me a present, but you want me to help you choose it? No, I know what it is. It's just that he laughed and shrugged. Oh, I might as well tell you. In that shop we were in, they had this shelf with loads of records and tapes. So I was looking for the one you lost that time. Do you remember, Kath? Except I couldn't remember what it was anymore. My tape? I didn't realize you ever knew about it, Tommy. Oh yeah. Ruth was getting people to look for it and saying you were really upset about losing it. So I tried to find it. I never told you at the time, but I did try really hard. I thought there'd be places I could look where you couldn't. In boys' dorms, stuff like that. I remember looking for ages, but I couldn't find it. I glanced at him and felt my rotten mood evaporating. I never knew that, Tommy. That was really sweet of you. Well, it didn't help much. But I really wanted to find it for you. And when it looked in the end like it wasn't going to turn up, I just said to myself, one day I'll go to Norfolk and I'll find it there for her. The lost corner of England, I said, and looked around me. And here we are. Tommy too looked around him, and we came to a halt. We were in another side street not as narrow as the one with the gallery. For a moment we both kept glancing around theatrically, then giggled. So, it wasn't such a daft idea, Tommy said. That Woolworth shop earlier, it had all these tapes, so I thought they were bound to have yours. But I don't think they did. You don't think they did? Oh, Tommy, you mean you didn't even look properly? I did, Kath. It's just that, well, it's really annoying, but I couldn't remember what it was called. All that time at Hailsham, I was opening boys' collection chests and everything, and now I can't remember. It was Julie Bridges or something, Judy Bridgewater. Songs After Dark. Tommy shook his head solemnly. They definitely didn't have that. I laughed and punched his arm. He looked puzzled, so I said, Tommy, they wouldn't have something like that in Woolworth's. They have the latest hits. Judy Bridgewater, she's someone from ages ago. It just happened to turn up at one of our sales. It's not going to be in Woolworth's now, you idiot. Well, like I said, I don't know about things like that. But they had so many tapes, they had some, Tommy. Oh, never mind. It was a sweet idea. Im Realität. It was a great idea. This is Norfolk after all. We started walking again, and Tommy said hesitantly, well, that's why I had to tell you. I wanted to surprise you, but it's useless. I don't know where to look, even if I do know the name of the record. Now I've told you, you can help me. We can look for it together. Tommy, what are you talking about? I was trying to sound reproachful, but I couldn't help laughing. Well, we've got over an hour. This is a real chance. Tommy, you idiot. You really believe it, don't you? All this lost corner stuff. I don't necessarily believe it. But we might as well look now we're here. I mean, you'd like to find it again, wouldn't you? What have we got to lose? All right. You're a complete idiot, but all right. He opened his arms out helplessly. Well, Kath, where do we go? Like I say, I'm no good at shopping. We have to look in secondhand places, I said after a moment's thought. Places full of old clothes, old books. They'll sometimes have a box full of records and tapes. Okay. But where are these shops? When I think of that moment, now standing with Tommy in the little side street about to begin our search, I feel a warmth welling up through me. Everything suddenly felt perfect, an hour set aside stretching ahead of us, and there wasn't a better way to spend it. I had to really hold myself back from giggling stupidly or jumping up and down on the pavement like a little kid. Not long ago, when I was caring for Tommy and I brought up our Norfolk trip, he told me had felt exactly the same. That moment when we decided to go searching for my lost tape, it was like suddenly every cloud had blown away and we had nothing but fun and laughter before us. At the start, we kept going into the wrong sort of places, secondhand bookshops or shops full of old vacuum cleaners, but no music at all. After a while, Tommy decided I didn't know any better than he did and announced he would lead the way. As it happened by sheer luck, really, he discovered straight away a street with 4 shops of just the kind we were after standing virtually in a row. Their front windows were full of dresses, handbags, children's annuals, and when you went inside, a sweet stale smell. There were piles of creased paperbacks, dusty boxes full of postcards or trinkets. One shop specialized in hippie stuff, while another had war medals and photos of soldiers in the desert. But they all had somewhere a big cardboard box or 2 with LPs and cassette tapes. We rummaged around those shops, and in all honesty, after the first few minutes, I think Judy Bridgewater had more or less slipped from our minds. We were just enjoying looking through all those things together, drifting apart, then finding ourselves side by side again, maybe competing for the same box of bric-a-brac in a dusty corner lit up by a shaft of sun. Then, of course, I found it. I'd been flicking through a row of cassette cases, my mind on other things, when suddenly there it was under my fingers, looking just the way it had all those years ago. Judy, her cigarette, the coquettish look for the barman, the blurred palms in the background. I didn't exclaim the way I'd been doing when I'd come across other items that had mildly excited me. I stood there quite still, looking at the plastic case, unsure whether or not I was delighted. For a second, it even felt like a mistake. The tape had been the perfect excuse for all this fun, and now it had turned up where I'd have to stop. Maybe that was why, to my own surprise, I kept silent at first, why I thought about pretending never to have seen it. And now it was there in front of me. There was something vaguely embarrassing about the tape, like it was something I should have grown out of. I actually went as far as flicking the cassette on and letting its neighbor fall on it. But there was the spine looking up at me, and in the end I called Tommy over. "Is that it?" He seemed genuinely skeptical, perhaps because I wasn't making more fuss. I pulled it out and held it in both hands. Then suddenly I felt a huge pleasure and something else, something more complicated that threatened to make me burst into tears. But I got a hold of the emotion and just gave Tommy's arm a tug. "Yes, this is it," I said, and for the first time smiled excitedly. "Can you believe it? We've really found it. Do you think it could be the same one? I mean the actual one. The one you lost?" As I turned it in my fingers, I found I could remember all the design details on the back, the titles of the tracks, everything. "For all I know, it might be," I said. "But I have to tell you, Tommy, there might be thousands of these knocking about." Then it was my turn to notice Tommy wasn't as triumphant as he might be. "Tommy, you don't seem very pleased for me," I said, though in an obviously jokey voice. "I am pleased for you, Kath. It's just that, well, I wish I'd found it." Then he did a small laugh and went on, "Back then, when you lost it, I used to think about it in my head, what it would be like if I found it and brought it to you. What you'd say, your face, all of that." His voice was softer than usual, and he kept his eyes on the plastic case in my hand. And I suddenly became very conscious of the fact that we were the only people in the shop except for the old guy behind the counter at the front, engrossed in his paperwork. We were right at the back of the shop on a raised platform where it was darker and more secluded, like the old guy didn't want to think about the stuff in our area and had mentally curtained it off. For several seconds, Tommy stayed in a sort of trance, for all I know, playing over in his mind one of these old fantasies of giving me back my lost tape. Then suddenly, he snatched the case out of my hand. "Well, at least I can buy it for you," he said with a grin, and before I could stop him, had started down the floor towards the front. I went on browsing around the back of the shop while the old guy searched around for the tape to go with the case. I was still feeling a pang of regret that we'd found it so quickly, and it was only later, when we were back at the cottages and I was alone in my room, that I really appreciated having the tape and that song back again. Even then, it was mainly a nostalgia thing, and today, if I happen to get the tape out and look at it, it brings back memories of that afternoon in Norfolk every bit as much as it does our Hailsham days. As we came out of the shop, I was keen to regain the carefree, almost silly mood we'd been in before. But when I made a few little jokes, Tommy was lost in his thoughts and didn't respond. We began going up a steeply climbing path, and we could see maybe 100 yards further UPA kind of viewing area right on the cliff edge with benches facing out to sea. It would have made a nice spot in the summer for an ordinary family to sit and eat a picnic. Now, despite the chilly wind, we found ourselves walking up towards it, but when there was still some way left to go, Tommy slowed to a dawdle and said to me, "Chrissy and Rodney, they're really obsessed with this idea. You know, the one about people having their donations deferred if they're really in love. They're convinced we know all about it, but no one said anything like that at Hailsham. At least I never heard anything like that, did you, Kath? No, it's just something going around recently among the veterans. And people like Ruth, they've been stoking it up." I looked at him carefully, but it was hard to tell if he'd just spoken with mischievous affection or else a kind of disgust. I could see anyway there was something else on his mind, nothing to do with Ruth, so I didn't say anything and waited. Eventually, he came to a complete halt and started to poke around with his foot a squashed paper cup on the ground. "Actually, Kath," he said, "I've been thinking about it for a while. I'm sure we're right, there was no talk like that when we were at Hailsham. But there were a lot of things that didn't make sense back then. And I've been thinking, if it's true, this rumor, then it could explain quite a lot. Stuff we used to puzzle over." "What do you mean? What sort of stuff?" "The gallery, for instance." Tommy had lowered his voice, and I stepped in closer, just as though we were still at Hailsham talking in the dinner queue or beside the pond. "We never got to the bottom of it, what the gallery was for. Why Madam took away all the best work. But now I think I know. Kath, you remember that time everyone was arguing about tokens? Whether they should get them or not to make up for stuff they'd had taken away by Madam. And Roy J. went in to see Miss Emily about it? Well, there was something Miss Emily said then, something she let drop, and that's what's been making me think. Two women were passing by with dogs on leads, and although it was completely stupid, we both stopped talking until they'd gone further up the slope and out of earshot. Then I said, 'What thing, Tommy?' 'What thing Miss Emily let drop?' When Roy J. asked her why Madam took our stuff away. Do you remember what she's supposed to have said? I remember her saying it was a privilege and we should be proud, but that wasn't all." Tommy's voice was now down to a whisper. "What she told Roy, what she let slip, which she probably didn't mean to let slip, do you remember, Kath? She told Roy that things like pictures, poetry, all that kind of stuff, she said they revealed what you were like inside. She said they revealed your soul." When he said this, I suddenly remembered a drawing Laura had done once of her intestines and laughed. But something was coming back to me. "That's right," I said. "I remember. So what are you getting at?" "What I think," said Tommy slowly, "is this. Suppose it's true what the veterans are saying. Suppose some special arrangement has been made for Hailsham students. Suppose two people say they're truly in love and they want extra time to be together. Then you see, Kat, there has to be a way to judge if they're really telling the truth. That they aren't just saying they're in love just to defer their donations. You see how difficult it could be to decide. Or a couple might really believe they're in love, but it's just a sex thing. Or just a crush. You see what I mean, Kath? It'll be really hard to judge, and it's probably impossible to get it right every time. But the point is, whoever decides, Madam or whoever it is, they need something to go on." I nodded slowly. "So, that's why they took away our art, it could be. Madam's got a gallery somewhere filled with stuff by students from when they were tiny. Suppose two people come up and say they're in love. She can find the art they've done over years and years. She can see if they go. If they match. Don't forget, Kath, what she's got reveals our souls. She could decide for herself what's a good match and what's just a stupid crush. I started to walk slowly again, hardly looking in front of me. Tommy fell in step waiting for my response. I'm not sure, I said in the end. What you're saying could certainly explain Miss Emily what she said to Roy. And I suppose it explains too why the Guardians always thought it was so important for us to be able to paint and all of that. Exactly. And that's why Tommy sighed and went on with some effort. That's why Miss Lucy had to admit she'd been wrong telling me it didn't really matter. She'd said that because she was sorry for me at the time. But she knew deep down it did matter. The thing about being from Hailsham was that you had this special chance. And if you didn't get stuff into Madam's gallery, then you were as good as throwing that chance away. It was after he said this that it suddenly dawned on me with a real chill where this was leading. I stopped and turned to him, but before I could speak, Tommy let out a laugh. If I've got this right, then well, it looks like I might have blown my chance. Tommy, did you ever get anything into the gallery? When you were much younger, maybe. He was already shaking his head. You know how useless I was. And then there was that stuff with Miss Lucy. I know she meant well. She was sorry for me, and she wanted to help me. I'm sure she did. But if my theory's right, well, it's only a theory, Tommy, I said. You know what your theories are like. I wanted to lighten things a bit, but I couldn't get the tone right, and it must have been obvious I was still thinking hard about what Head just said. Maybe they've got all sorts of ways to judge, I said after a moment. Maybe the arts just won out of all kinds of different ways. Tommy shook his head again. Like what? Madam never got to know us. She wouldn't remember us individually. Besides, it's probably not just Madam that decides. There's probably people higher up than her, people who never set foot in Hailsham. I've thought about this a lot, Kath. It all fits. That's why the gallery was so important and why the Guardians wanted us to work so hard on our art and our poetry. Kath, what are you thinking? Sure enough, ID drifted off a bit. Actually, I was thinking about that afternoon I'd been alone in our dorm playing the tape. We'd just found how I'd been swaying around, clutching a pillow to my breast, and how Madam had been watching me from the doorway, tears in her eyes. Even this episode, for which I'd never yet found a convincing explanation, seemed to fit Tommy's theory. In my head, I'd been imagining I was holding a baby, but of course there'd have been no way for Madam to know that. She'd have supposed I was holding a lover in my arms. If Tommy's theory was right, if Madam was connected to us for the sole purpose of deferring our donations when later on we fell in love, then it made sense for all her usual coldness towards us to be really moved stumbling on a scene like that. All this flashed through my mind, and I was on the point of blurting it all out to Tommy. But I held back because I wanted now to play down his theory. I was just thinking over what you said, that's all I said. We should start going back now. It might take us a while to find the car park. We began to retrace our steps down the slope, but we knew we still had time and didn't hurry. Tommy, I asked after we'd been walking for a while. Have you said any of this to Ruth? He shook his head and went on walking. Eventually, he said the thing is Ruth believes it all, everything the veterans are saying. Okay, she likes to pretend she knows much more than she does. But she does believe it. And sooner or later she's going to want to take it further. You mean she'll want to, yeah. She'll want to apply. But she hasn't thought it through yet. Not the way we just did. You've never told her your theory about the gallery? He shook his head again but said nothing. If you tell her your theory, I said, and she buys it, well, she's going to be furious. Tommy seemed thoughtful but still didn't say anything. It wasn't until we were back down in the narrow side streets that he spoke again, and then his voice was suddenly sheepish. Actually, Kath, he said, I have been doing some stuff. Just in case. I haven't told anyone, not even Ruth. It's just a start. That was when I first heard about his imaginary animals. When he started to describe what had been doing, I didn't actually see anything until a few weeks later. I found it hard to show much enthusiasm. In fact, I have to admit I was reminded of the original elephant in the grass picture that had started off all Tommy's problems at Hailsham. The inspiration, he explained, had come from an old children's book with the back cover missing, which had found behind one of the sofas at the cottages. Head then persuaded Kefers to give him one of the little black notebooks he scribbled his figures in, and since then Tommy had finished at least a dozen of his fantastic creatures. The thing is, I'm doing them really small. Tiny. ID never thought of that at Hailsham. I think maybe that's where I went wrong. If you make them tiny and you have to, because the pages are only about this big, then everything changes. It's like they come to life by themselves. Then you have to draw in all these different details for them. You have to think about how they'd protect themselves, how they'd reach things. Honest, Kath, it's nothing like anything I ever did at Hailsham. He started describing his favorites, but I couldn't really concentrate. The more excited he got telling me about his animals, the more uneasy I was growing. Tommy, I wanted to say to him, you're going to make yourself a laughingstock all over again. Imaginary animals? What's up with you? But I didn't. I just looked at him cautiously and kept saying, that sounds really good, Tommy. Then he said at one point, like I said, Kath, Ruth doesn't know about the animals. And when he said this, he seemed to remember everything else and why I'd been talking about his animals in the first place, and the energy faded from his face. Then we were walking in silence again, and as we came out onto the high street, I said, well, even if there's something to your theory, Tommy, there's a lot more we'll have to find out. For one thing, how's a couple supposed to apply? What are they supposed to do? There aren't exactly forms lying about. I've been wondering about all of that too. His voice was quiet and solemn again. As far as I can see, there's only one obvious way forward. And that's to find Madam. I gave this a think, then said that might not be so easy. We don't really know a thing about her. We don't even know her name. And you remember how she was? She didn't like us even coming near her. Even if we did ever track her down, I don't see her helping much. Tommy sighed. I know, he said. Well, I suppose we've got time. None of us are in any particular hurry. By the time we got back to the car park, the afternoon had clouded over and was growing pretty chilly. There was no sign of the others yet, so Tommy and I leaned against our car and looked towards the mini golf course. No one was playing and the flags were fluttering away in the wind. I didn't want to talk any more about Madame the Gallery or any of the rest of it, so I got the Judy Bridgewater tape out from its little bag and gave it a good look over. Thanks for buying this for me, I said. Tommy smiled. If I'd got to that tape box and you were on the LP, I'd have found it first. It was bad luck for poor old Tommy. It doesn't make any difference. We only found it because you said to look for it. I'd forgotten about all this lost corner stuff. After Ruth going on like that, I was in such a mood. Judy Bridgewater. My old friend. It's like she's never been away. I wonder who stole it back then? For a moment we turned towards the street looking for the others. You know, Tommy said when Ruth said what she did earlier on, and I saw how upset you looked. Leave it, Tommy. I'm all right about it now. And I'm not going to bring it up with her when she comes back. No, that's not what I was getting at. He took his weight off the car, turned and pressed a foot against the front tire as though to test it. What I meant was, I realized then when Ruth came out with all that, I realized why you keep looking through those porn mags. Okay, I haven't realized. It's just a theory. Another of my theories. But when Ruth said what she did earlier on, it kind of clicked. I knew he was looking at me, but I kept my eyes straight ahead and made no response. But I still don't really get it, Kath, he said eventually. Even if what Ruth says is right, and I don't think it is, why are you looking through old porn mags for your possibles? Why would your model have to be one of those girls? I shrugged, still not looking at him. I don't claim it makes sense. It's just something I do. There were tears filling my eyes now, and I tried to hide them from Tommy. But my voice wobbled as I said, if it annoys you so much, I won't do it anymore. I don't know if Tommy saw the tears. In any case, I'd got them under control by the time he came close to me and gave my shoulders a squeeze. This was something had done before from time to time. It wasn't anything special or new. But somehow I did feel better and gave a little laugh. He let go of me then, but we stayed almost touching side by side again, our backs to the car. Okay, there's no sense in it, I said. But we all do it, don't we? We all wonder about our model. Kath, you know, don't you? I haven't told anyone. Not Ruth, not anyone. But I just don't get it. I'll tell you. And with Oliver. It didn't mean anything deep down. I don't even like them much. That's why I started thinking, well, it has to come from somewhere. I stopped, but when Tommy didn't say anything, I went on. So I thought if I find her picture in one of those magazines, ITLL at least explain it. I wouldn't want to go and find her or anything. I get it too sometimes, said Tommy. When I really feel like doing it. I reckon everyone does if they're honest. I don't think there's anything different about you, Kath. In fact, I get like that quite a lot. He broke off and laughed, but I didn't laugh with him. What I'm talking about's different, I said. I've watched other people. They get in the mood for it, but that doesn't make them do things. They never do things like I've done. Going with people like that Huey, I might have started crying again because I felt Tommy's arm going back around my shoulders. Upset as I was, I remained conscious of where we were, and I made a kind of check in my mind that if Ruth and the others came up the street, even if they saw us at that moment, there'd be no room for misunderstanding. We were still side by side leaning against the car, and they'd see I was upset about something and Tommy was just comforting me. Then I heard him say, I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. Once you find someone, Kath, someone you really want to be with, then it could be really good. Remember what the Guardians used to tell us? If it's with the right person, it makes you feel really good. I made a movement with my shoulder to get Tommy's arm off me, then took a deep breath. Let's forget it. Anyway, I've got much better at controlling these moods when they come on. So, let's just forget it. All the same, Kath, it's stupid looking through those magazines. It's stupid, okay. Tommy, let's leave it. I'm all right now. I don't remember what else we talked about until the others showed up. We didn't discuss any more of those serious things, and if the others sensed something still in the air, they didn't remark on it. They were in good spirits, and Ruth in particular seemed determined to make up for the bad scene earlier on. She came up and touched my cheek, making some joke or other, and once we got in the car, she made sure the jovial mood kept going. She and Chrissy had found everything about Martin comical and were relishing the chance to laugh openly about him now they'd left his flat. Rodney looked disapproving, and I realized Ruth and Chrissy were making a song and dance of it mainly to tease him. It all seemed good-natured enough. But what I noticed was that whereas before Ruth would have taken the opportunity to keep me and Tommy in the dark about all the jokes and references throughout the journey back, she kept turning to me and explaining carefully everything they were talking about. In fact, it got a bit tiring after a while because it was like everything being said in the car was for our, at least, special benefit. But I was pleased Ruth was making such a fuss. I understood, as did Tommy, that Shed recognized Shed behaved badly before, and this was her way of admitting it. We were sitting with her in the middle just as we'd done on the journey out, but now she spent all her time talking to me, turning occasionally to her other side to give Tommy a little squeeze or the odd kiss. It was a good atmosphere, and no one brought up Ruth's possible or anything like that. And I didn't mention the Judy Bridgewater tape Tommy had bought me. I knew Ruth would find out about it sooner or later, but I didn't want her to find out just yet. On that journey home, with the darkness setting in over those long, empty roads, it felt like the three of us were close again, and I didn't want anything to come along and break that mood. Chapter 16. The odd thing about our Norfolk trip was that once we got back, we hardly talked about it. So much so that for a while all kinds of rumors went around about what we'd been up to. Even then, we kept pretty quiet until eventually people lost interest. I'm still not sure why this happened. Perhaps we felt it was up to Ruth, that it was her call how much got told, and we were waiting to take our cue from her. And Ruth, for one reason or another, maybe she was embarrassed how things had turned out with her, possible maybe she was enjoying the mystery, had remained completely closed on the subject. Even among ourselves, we avoided talking about the trip. This air of secrecy made it easier for me to keep from telling Ruth about Tommy buying me the Judy Bridgewater tape. I didn't go as far as actually hiding the thing. It was always there in my collection in one of my little piles next to the skirting board. But I always made sure not to leave it out or on top of a pile. There were times when I wanted badly to tell her, when I wanted us to reminisce about Hailsham with the tape playing in the background. But the further away we got from the Norfolk trip, and I still hadn't told her, the more it came to feel like a guilty secret. Of course, she did spot the tape in the end much later, and it was probably a much worse time for her to find it, but that's the way your luck sometimes goes. As spring came on, there seemed to be more and more veterans leaving to start their training, and though they left without fuss in the usual way, the increased numbers made them impossible to ignore. I'm not sure what our feelings were witnessing these departures. I suppose to some extent we envied the people leaving. It did feel like they were headed for a bigger, more exciting world. But of course, without a doubt, their going made us increasingly uneasy. Then I think it was around April, Alice F. became the first of our Hailsham bunch to leave, and not long after that Gordon C. did too. They'd both asked to start their training and went off with cheerful smiles, but after that, for our lot anyway, the atmosphere at the cottages changed forever. Many veterans too seemed affected by the flurry of departures, and maybe as a direct result there was a fresh spate of rumors of the sort Chrissy and Rodney had spoken about in Norfolk. Talk went around of students somewhere else in the country getting deferrals because they'd shown they were in love, and now just sometimes the talk was of students with no connections to Hailsham. Here again, the five of us who'd been to Norfolk backed away from these topics. Even Chrissy and Rodney, who'd once been at the center of just this sort of talk, now looked awkwardly away when these rumors got going. The Norfolk effect even got to me and Tommy. I'd been assuming once we were back we'd be taking little opportunities whenever we were alone to exchange more thoughts on his theory about the gallery. But for some reason, it wasn't any more him than met his never really happened. The one exception, I suppose, was that time in the goose house the morning when he showed me his imaginary animals. The barn we called the goose house was on the outer fringes of the cottages, and because the roof leaked badly and the door was permanently off its hinges, it wasn't used for anything much other than as a place for couples to sneak off to in the warmer months. By then, I'd taken to going for long solitary walks, and I think I was setting out on one of these and had just gone past the goose house when I heard Tommy calling me. I turned to see him in his bare feet, perched awkwardly on a bit of dry ground surrounded by huge puddles, one hand on the side of the barn to keep his balance. "What happened to your wellies, Tommy?" I asked. Aside from his bare feet, he was dressed in his usual thick jumper and jeans. "I was, drawing," he laughed, and held up a little black notebook similar to the ones Keffers always went around with. It was by then over 2 months since the Norfolk trip, but I realized as soon as I saw the notebook what this was about. But I waited for him to say, "If you like, Kath, I'll show you." He led the way into the goose house, hopping over the jaggy ground. I'd expected it to be dark inside, but the sunlight was pouring through the skylights. Pushed against one wall were various bits of furniture heaved out over the past year or so, broken tables, old fridges, that kind of thing. Tommy appeared to have dragged into the middle of the floor a two-seater settee with stuffing poking out of its black plastic, and I guessed had been sitting in it doing his drawing when I'd gone past. Just nearby, his Wellingtons were lying fallen on their sides, his football socks peeking out of the tops. Tommy jumped back onto the settee, nursing his big toe. "Sorry, my feet poo a bit." I took everything off without realizing. "I think I've cut myself now. Kath, do you want to see these? Ruth looked at them last week, so I've been meaning to show you ever since." No one's seen them apart from Ruth. "Have a look, Kath." That was when I first saw his animals. When had told me about them in Norfolk, I'd seen in my mind scaled-down versions of the sort of pictures we'd done when we were small. So I was taken aback at how densely detailed each one was. In fact, it took a moment to see they were animals at all. The first impression was like one you'd get if you took the back off a radio set. Tiny canals, weaving tendons, miniature screws, and wheels were all drawn with obsessive precision, and only when you held the page away could you see it was some kind of armadillo, say, or a bird. "It's my second book," Tommy said. "There's no way anyone's seeing the first one." It took me a while to get going. He was lying back on the settee now, tugging a sock over his foot and trying to sound casual, but I knew he was anxious for my reaction. Even so, for some time I didn't come up with wholehearted praise. Maybe it was partly my worry that any artwork was liable to get him into trouble all over again. But also what I was looking at was so different from anything the Guardians had taught us to do at Hailsham, I didn't know how to judge it. I did say something like, "God, Tommy, these must take so much concentration. I'm surprised you can see well enough in here to do all this tiny stuff." And then, as I flicked through the pages perhaps because I was still struggling to find the right thing to say, I came out with, "I wonder what Madam would say if she saw these." ID said it in a jokey tone and Tommy responded with a little snigger, but then there was something hanging in the air that hadn't been there before. I went on turning the pages of the notebook. It was about a quarter full, not looking up at him, wishing ID never brought up Madam. Finally, I heard him say, "I suppose you'll have to get a lot better before she gets to see any of it." I wasn't sure if this was a cue for me to say how good the drawings were, but by this time I was becoming genuinely drawn to these fantastical creatures in front of me. For all their busy metallic features, there was something sweet, even vulnerable about each of them. I remembered him telling me in Norfolk that he worried even as he created them how they'd protect themselves or be able to reach and fetch things, and looking at them now I could feel the same sort of concerns. Even so, for some reason, I couldn't fathom something continued to stop me coming out with praise. Then Tommy said, "Anyway, it's not only because of all that I'm doing the animals. I just like doing them. I was wondering, Kath, if I should go on keeping it secret. I was thinking maybe there's no harm in people knowing I do these. Hannah still does her watercolors, a lot of the veterans do stuff. I don't mean I'm going to go around showing everyone exactly. But I was thinking, well, there's no reason why I should keep it all secret anymore." At last, I was able to look up at him and say with some conviction, "Tommy, there's no reason at all. These are good. Really, really good. In fact, if that's why you're hiding in here now, it's really daft." He didn't say anything in response, but a kind of smirk appeared over his face like he was enjoying a joke with himself, and I knew how happy ID made him. I don't think we spoke much more to each other after that. I think before long, he got his Wellingtons on, and we both left the Goose House. As I say, that was about the only time Tommy and I touched directly on his theory that spring. Then the summer came and the 1-year point from when Wed first arrived. A batch of new students turned up in a minibus much as Wed done, but none of them were from Hailsham. This was in some ways a relief. I think we'd all been getting anxious about how a fresh lot of Hailsham students might complicate things. But for me at least, this non-appearance of Hailsham students just added to a feeling that Hailsham was now far away in the past and that the ties binding our old crowd were fraying. It wasn't just that people like Hannah were always talking about following Alice's example and starting their training. Others like Laura had found boyfriends who weren't Hailsham, and you could almost forget they'd ever had much to do with us. And then there was the way Ruth kept pretending to forget things about Hailsham. Okay, these were mostly trivial things, but I got more and more irritated with her. There was the time, for instance, we were sitting around the kitchen table after a long breakfast, Ruth, me, and a few veterans. One of the veterans had been talking about how eating cheese late at night always disturbed your sleep, and ID turned to Ruth to say something like, "You remember how Miss Geraldine always used to tell us that?" It was just a casual aside, and all it needed was for Ruth to smile or nod. What, she made a point of staring back at me blankly like she didn't have the faintest what I was talking about. Only when I said to the veterans, by way of explanation, one of our guardians, did Ruth give a frowning nod as though she'd just that moment remembered. I let her get away with it that time. But there was another occasion when I didn't. That evening we were sitting out in the ruined bus shelter. I got angry then, because it was one thing to play this game in front of veterans, quite another when it was just the two of us in the middle of a serious talk. ID referred just in passing to the fact that at Hailsham the shortcut down to the pond through the rhubarb patch was out of bounds. When she put on her puzzled look, I abandoned whatever point ID been trying to make and said, "Ruth, there's no way you've forgotten. So don't give me that." Perhaps if I hadn't pulled her up so sharply, perhaps if ID just made a joke of it and carried on, she'd have seen how absurd it was and laughed. But because ID snapped at her, Ruth glared back and said, "What does it matter anyway? What's the rhubarb patch got to do with any of this? Just get on with what you were saying." It was getting late, the summer evening was fading, and the old bus shelter felt musty and damp after a recent thunderstorm. So I didn't have the head to go into why it mattered so much. And though I did just drop it and carry on with the discussion we'd been having, the atmosphere had gone chilly and could hardly have helped us get through the difficult matter in hand. But to explain what we were talking about that evening, I'll have to go back a little bit. In fact, I'll have to go back several weeks to the earlier part of the summer. I'd been having a relationship with one of the veterans, a boy called Lenny, which, to be honest, had been mainly about the sex. But then had suddenly opted to start his training and left. This unsettled me a little, and Ruth had been great about it, watching over me without seeming to make a fuss, always ready to cheer me up if I seemed gloomy. She also kept doing little favors for me, like making me sandwiches or taking on parts of my cleaning rota. Then, about a fortnight after Lenny had gone, the two of us were sitting in my attic room sometime after midnight, chatting over mugs of tea, and Ruth got me really laughing about Lenny. He hadn't been such a bad guy, but once ID started telling Ruth some of the more intimate things about him, it did seem like everything to do with him was hilarious, and we just kept laughing and laughing. Then, at one point, Ruth was running a finger up and down the cassettes stacked in little piles along my skirting board. She was doing this in an absent-minded sort of way, while she kept laughing, but afterwards I went through a spell of suspecting it hadn't been by chance at all that she'd noticed it there, maybe days before, perhaps even examined it to make sure, then had waited for the best time to find it. Years later, I gently hinted this to Ruth, and she didn't seem to know what I was talking about, so maybe I was wrong. Anyway, there we were, laughing and laughing each time I came out with another detail about poor Lenny, and then suddenly it was like a plug had been pulled out. There was Ruth lying on her side across my rug, peering at the spines of the cassettes in the low light, and then the Judy Bridgewater tape was in her hands. After what seemed an eternity, she said, "So how long have you had this again?" I told her as neutrally as I could about how Tommy and I had come across it that day while she'd been gone with the others. She went on examining it, then said, "So Tommy found it for you?" "No. I found it. I saw it first. Neither of you told me." She shrugged. "At least if you did, I never heard." "The Norfolk thing was true," I said. "You know about it being the lost corner of England." It did flash through my mind Ruth would pretend not to remember this reference, but she nodded thoughtfully. "I should have remembered at the time," she said. "I might have found my red scarf then." We both laughed, and the uneasiness seemed to pass. But there was something about the way Ruth put the tape back without discussing it any further that made me think it wasn't finished with yet. I don't know if the way the conversation went after that was something controlled by Ruth in the light of her discovery, or if we were headed that way anyway, and that it was only afterwards Ruth realized she could do with it what she did. We went back to discussing Lenny, in particular, a lot of stuff about how he had sex, and we were laughing away again. At that point, I think I was just relieved she'd finally found the tape and not made a huge scene about it, and so maybe I wasn't being as careful as I might have been. Because before long, we'd drifted from laughing about Lenny to laughing about Tommy. At first, it had all felt good-natured enough, like we were just being affectionate towards him. But then we were laughing about his animals. As I say, I've never been sure whether or not Ruth deliberately moved things round to this. To be fair, I can't even say for certain she was the one who first mentioned the animals. And once we started, I was laughing just as much as she was about how one of them looked like it was wearing underpants, how another had to have been inspired by a squashed hedgehog. I suppose I should have said in there somewhere that the animals were good, that had done really well to have got where he had with them. But I didn't. That was partly because of the tape, and maybe, if I have to be honest, because I was pleased by the notion that Ruth wasn't taking the animals seriously and everything that implied. I think when we eventually broke up for the night, we felt as close as we'd ever done. She touched my cheek on her way out, saying, "It's really good the way you always keep your spirits up, Kathy." So I wasn't prepared at all for what happened at the churchyard several days later. Ruth had discovered that summer a lovely old church about half a mile from the cottages, which had behind it rambling grounds with very old gravestones leaning in the grass. Everything was overgrown, but it was really peaceful, and Ruth had taken to doing a lot of her reading there near the back railings on a bench under a big willow. I hadn't at first been too keen on this development, remembering how the previous summer we'd all sat around together in the grass right outside the cottages. All the same, if I was headed that way on one of my walks, and I knew Ruth was likely to be there, I'd find myself going through the low wooden gate and along the overgrown path past the gravestones. On that afternoon it was warm and still, and I'd come down the path in a dreamy mood reading off names on the stones when I saw not only Ruth, but Tommy on the bench under the willow. Ruth was actually sitting on the bench while Tommy was standing with one foot up on its rusty armrest, doing a kind of stretching exercise as they talked. It didn't look like they were having any big conversation, and I didn't hesitate to go up to them. Maybe I should have picked up something in the way they greeted me, but I'm sure there wasn't anything obvious. I had some gossip. I was dying to tell them something about one of the newcomers, and so for a while it was just me blabbing on while they nodded and asked the odd question. It was some time before it occurred to me something wasn't right, and even then when I paused and asked, "Did I interrupt something here?" It was in a jokey sort of way. But then Ruth said, "Tommy's been telling me about his big theory. He says he's already told you. Ages ago. But now very kindly he's allowing me to share in it too." Tommy gave a sigh and was about to say something, but Ruth said in a mock whisper, "Tommy's big gallery theory." Then they were both looking at me like I was now in charge of everything and it was up to me what happened next. "It's not a bad theory," I said. "It might be right, I don't know. What do you think, Ruth?" I had to really dig it out of Sweet Boy here. "Not very keen at all on letting me in on it, were you, Sweetagums?" It was only when I kept pressing him to tell me what was behind all this art. "I'm not doing it just for that," Tommy said sulkily. His foot was still up on the armrest, and he kept on with his stretching. All I said was if it was right about the gallery, then I could always try and put in the animals. "Tommy, sweetie, don't make a fool of yourself in front of our friend. Do it to me, that's all right. But not in front of our dear Kathy." "I don't see why it's such a joke," Tommy said. "It's as good a theory as anyone else's." "It's not the theory people will find funny, Sweetagums. They might well buy the theory right enough. But the idea that you'll swing it by showing Madam your little animals." Ruth smiled and shook her head. Tommy said nothing and continued with his stretching. I wanted to come to his defense and was trying to think of just the right thing that would make him feel better without making Ruth even more angry. But that was when Ruth said what she did. It felt bad enough at the time, but I had no idea in the churchyard that day how far-reaching the repercussions would be. What she said was, "It's not just me, sweetie. Kathy here finds your animals a complete hoot." My first instinct was to deny it, then just to laugh. But there was a real authority about the way Ruth had spoken, and the three of us knew each other well enough to know there had to be something behind her words. So in the end, I stayed silent while my mind searched back frantically, and with a cold horror settled on that night up in my room with our mugs of tea. Then Ruth said, "As long as people think you're doing those little creatures as a kind of joke, fine. But don't give out you're serious about it. Please." Tommy had stopped his stretching and was looking questioningly at me. Suddenly, he was really childlike again with no front whatsoever, and I could see too something dark and troubling gathering behind his eyes. "Look, Tommy, you've got to understand," Ruth went on. "If Kathy and I have a good laugh about you, it doesn't really matter. Because that's just us. But please let's not bring everyone else in on it. I've thought about those moments over and over. I should have found something to say. I could have just denied it, though Tommy probably wouldn't have believed me. And to try to explain the thing truthfully would have been too complicated. But I could have done something. I could have challenged." Ruth told her she was twisting things, that even if I might have laughed, it wasn't in the way she was implying. I could even have gone up to Tommy and hugged him right there in front of Ruth. That's something that came to me years later and probably wasn't a real option at the time given the person I was and the way the three of us were with each other. but that might have done it where words would only have got us in deeper. But I didn't say or do anything. It was partly, I suppose, that I was so floored by the fact that Ruth would come out with such a trick. I remember a huge tiredness coming over me, a kind of lethargy in the face of the tangled mess before me. It was like being given a maths problem when your brain's exhausted and you know there's some far-off solution, but you can't work up the energy even to give it a go. Something in me just gave up. A voice went, "All right, let him think the absolute worst. Let him think it, let him think it." And I suppose I looked at him with resignation, with a face that said, "Yes, it's true, what else did you expect?" And I can recall now as fresh as anything Tommy's own face, the anger receding for the moment, being replaced by an expression almost of wonder, like I was a rare butterfly had come across on a fence post. It wasn't that I thought I'd burst into tears or lose my temper or anything like that, but I decided just to turn and go. Even later that day I realized this was a bad mistake. All I can say is that at the time what I feared more than anything was that one or the other of them would stalk off first and I'd be left with the remaining one. I don't know why, but it didn't seem an option for more than one of us to storm off, and I wanted to make sure that one was me. So I turned and marched back the way I'd come, past the gravestones towards the low wooden gate, and for several minutes I felt as though I'd triumphed, that now they'd been left in each other's company, they were suffering a fate they thoroughly deserved. Chapter 17. As I've said, it wasn't until a long time afterwards, long after I'd left the cottages, that I realized just how significant our little encounter in the churchyard had been. I was upset at the time, yes. But I didn't believe it to be anything so different from other tiffs we'd had. It never occurred to me that our lives, until then so closely interwoven, could unravel and separate over a thing like that. But the fact was, I suppose there were powerful tides tugging us apart by then, and it only needed something like that to finish the task. If we'd understood that back then, who knows? Maybe we'd have kept a tighter hold of one another. For one thing, more and more students were going off to be carers, and among our old Hailsham crowd there was a growing feeling this was the natural course to follow. We still had our essays to finish, but it was well known we didn't really have to finish them if we chose to start our training. In our early days at the cottages, the idea of not finishing our essays would have been unthinkable. But the more distant Hailsham grew, the less important the essays seemed. I had this idea at the time, and I was probably right, that if our sense of the essays being important was allowed to seep away, then so too would whatever bound us together as Hailsham students. That's why I tried for a while to keep going our enthusiasm for all the reading and note-taking. But with no reason to suppose we'd ever see our guardians again, and with so many students, moving on it soon began to feel like a lost cause. Anyway, in the days after that talk in the churchyard, I did what I could to put it behind us. I behaved towards both Tommy and Ruth as though nothing special had occurred, and they did much the same. But there was always something there now, and it wasn't just between me and them. Though they still made a show of being a couple, they still did the punching in the arm thing when they parted. I knew them well enough to see they'd grown quite distant from each other. Of course I felt bad about it all, especially about Tommy's animals. But it wasn't as simple anymore as going to him and saying sorry and explaining how things really were. A few years earlier, even 6 months earlier, it might have worked out that way. Tommy and I would have talked it over and sorted it out. But somehow by that second summer things were different. Maybe it was because of this relationship with Lenny, I don't know. Anyway, talking to Tommy wasn't so easy anymore. On the surface, at least, it was much like before, but we never mentioned the animals or what had happened in the churchyard. So that was what had been happening just before I had that conversation with Ruth in the old bus shelter, when I got so annoyed with her for pretending to forget about the rhubarb patch at Hailsham. Like I said, I'd probably not have got nearly so cross if it hadn't come up in the middle of such a serious conversation. Okay, we'd got through a lot of the meat of it by then, but even so, even if we were just easing off and chatting by that point, that was still all part of our trying to sort things with each other, and there was no room for any pretend stuff like that. What had happened was this. Although something had come between me and Tommy, it hadn't quite got like that with Ruth, or at least that's what ID thought, and ID decided it was time I talked with her about what had happened in the churchyard. We'd just had one of those summer days of rain and thunderstorms, and we'd been cooped up indoors despite the humidity. So, when it appeared to clear for the evening with a nice pink sunset, I suggested to Ruth we get a bit of air. There was a steep footpath ID discovered leading up along the edge of the valley, and just where it came out onto the road was an old bus shelter. The buses had stopped coming ages ago. The bus stop sign had been taken away, and on the wall at the back of the shelter there was left only the frame of what must have once been a glassed-in notice displaying all the bus times. But the shelter itself, which was like a lovingly constructed wooden hut with one side open to the fields going down the valley, was still standing and even had its bench intact. So that's where Ruth and I were sitting to get our breath back, looking at the cobwebs up on the rafters and the summer evening outside. Then I said something like, Ruth, we should try and sort it out what happened the other day. ID made my voice conciliatory, and Ruth responded. She said immediately how daft it was, the three of us having rows over the most stupid things. She brought up other times we'd rowed, and we laughed a bit about them. But I didn't really want Ruth just to bury the thing like that, so I said, still in the least challenging voice I could, Ruth, I think sometimes when you're in a couple you don't see things as clearly as maybe someone can from the outside. Just sometimes. She nodded. That's probably right. I don't want to interfere. But sometimes, just lately, I think Tommy's been quite upset. About certain things you've said or done. I was worried Ruth would get angry, but she nodded and sighed. I think you're right, she said in the end. I've been thinking about it a lot too. Then maybe I shouldn't have brought it up. I should have known you'd see what was happening. It's not my business really. But it is, Kathy. You're really one of us, and so it's always your business. You're right, it hasn't been good. I know what you mean. That stuff the other day about his animals. That wasn't good. I told him I was sorry about that. I'm glad you talked it over. I didn't know if you had. Ruth had been picking at some molding flakes of wood on the bench beside her, and for a moment she seemed completely absorbed in this task. Then she said, Look, Kathy, it's good we're talking now about Tommy. I've been wanting to tell you something, but I've never quite known how to say it or when really. Kathy, promise you won't be too cross with me. I looked at her and said, as long as it's not about those t-shirts again. No, seriously. Promise you won't get too cross. Because I've got to tell you this. I wouldn't forgive myself if I kept quiet much longer. Okay, what is it? Kathy, I've been thinking this for some time. You're no fool, and you can see that maybe me and Tommy, we might not be a couple forever. That's no tragedy. We were right for each other once. Whether we always will be, that's anyone's guess. And now there's all this talk about couples getting deferrals if they can prove that they're really right. Okay, look, what I wanted to say, Kathy, is this. It'd be completely natural if you thought about what would happen if me and Tommy decided we shouldn't be together anymore. We're not about to split, don't get me wrong. But I do think it was completely normal if you at least wondered about it. Well, Kathy, what you have to realize is that Tommy doesn't see you like that. He really, really likes you. He thinks you're really great. But I know he doesn't see you like a proper girlfriend. Besides, Ruth paused, then sighed. Besides, how Tommy is. He can be fussy. I stared at her. What do you mean? You must know what I mean. Tommy doesn't like girls who've been with, with this person and that. It's just a thing he has. I'm sorry, Kathy, but it wouldn't be right not to have told you. I thought about it, then said it's always good to know these things. I felt Ruth touch my arm. I knew you'd take it the right way. What you've got to understand, though, is that he thinks the world of you. He really does. I wanted to change the subject, but for the moment my mind was a blank. I suppose Ruth must have picked up on this, because she stretched out her arms and did a kind of yawn, saying, if I ever learn to drive a car, I'd take us all on a trip to some wild place. Dartmoor, say. The three of us, maybe Laura and Hannah too. I'd love to see all the bogs and stuff. We spent the next several minutes talking about what we'd do on a trip like that if we ever went on one. I asked where we'd stay, and Ruth said we could borrow a big tent. I pointed out the wind could get really fierce in places like that, and our tent could easily blow away in the night. None of this was that serious. But it was around here I remembered the time back at Hailsham when we'd still been juniors, and we were having a picnic by the pond with Miss Geraldine. James B. had been sent to the main house to fetch the cake we'd all baked earlier, but as he was carrying it back, a strong gust of wind had taken off the whole top layer of sponge, tossing it into the rhubarb leaves. Ruth said she could only vaguely remember the incident, and ID said trying to clinch it for her memory the thing was he got into trouble because that proved had been coming down through the rhubarb patch. And that was when Ruth looked at me and said, "Why? What was wrong with that?" It was just the way she said it, suddenly so false even an onlooker, if there'd been one, would have seen through it. I sighed with irritation and said, "Ruth, don't give me that. There's no way you've forgotten. You know that route was out of bounds." Maybe it was a bit sharp the way I said it. Anyway, Ruth didn't back down. She continued pretending to remember nothing, and I got all the more irritated. And that was when she said, "What does it matter anyway? What's the rhubarb patch got to do with anything? Just get on with what you were saying." After that, I think we went back to talking in a more or less friendly way, and then, before long, we were making our way down the footpath in the half-light back to the cottages. But the atmosphere never quite righted itself, and when we said our goodnights in front of the black barn, we parted without our usual little touches on the arms and shoulders. It wasn't long after that I made my decision, and once ID made it, I never wavered. I just got up one morning and told Keffers I wanted to start my training to become a carer. It was surprisingly easy. He was walking across the yard, his Wellingtons covered in mud, grumbling to himself, and holding a piece of piping. I went up and told him, and he just looked at me like I'd bothered him about more firewood. Then he mumbled something about coming to see him later that afternoon to go through the forms. It was that easy. It took a little while after that, of course, but the whole thing had been set in motion, and I was suddenly looking at everything, the cottages, everybody there, in a different light. I was now one of the ones leaving, and soon enough everyone knew it. Maybe Ruth thought we'd be spending hours talking about my future. Maybe she thought she'd have a big influence on whether or not I changed my mind. But I kept a certain distance from her, just as I did from Tommy. We didn't really talk properly again at the cottages, and before I knew it, I was saying my goodbyes. Part 3, Chapter 18. For the most part, being a carer suited me fine. You could even say it's brought the best out of me. But some people just aren't cut out for it, and for them the whole thing becomes a real struggle. They might start off positively enough, but then comes all that time spent so close to the pain and the worry. And sooner or later a donor doesn't make it, even though, say, it's only the second donation and no one anticipated complications. When a donor completes like that out of the blue, it doesn't make much difference what the nurses say to you afterwards, and neither does that letter saying how they're sure you did all you could and to keep up the good work. For a while at least, you're demoralized. Some of us learn pretty quick how to deal with it, but others, like Laura, say they never do. Then there's the solitude. You grow up surrounded by crowds of people, that's all you've ever known, and suddenly you're a carer. You spend hour after hour on your own, driving across the country, center to center, hospital to hospital, sleeping in overnights, no one to talk to about your worries, no one to have a laugh with. Just now and again you run into a student you know, a carer or donor you recognize from the old days, but there's never much time. You're always in a rush, or else you're too exhausted to have a proper conversation. Soon enough, the long hours, the traveling, the broken sleep have all crept into your being and become part of you, so everyone can see it in your posture, your gaze, the way you move and talk. I don't claim I've been immune to all of this, but I've learned to live with it. Some carers, though, their whole attitude lets them down. A lot of them, you can tell, are just going through the motions, waiting for the day they're told they can stop and become donors. It really gets me too, the way so many of them shrink the moment they step inside a hospital. They don't know what to say to the whitecoats, they can't make themselves speak up on behalf of their donor. No wonder they end up feeling frustrated and blaming themselves when things go wrong. I try not to make a nuisance of myself, but I've figured out how to get my voice heard when I have to. And when things go badly, of course, I'm upset, but at least I can feel I've done all I could and keep things in perspective. Even the solitude I've actually grown to quite like. That's not to say I'm not looking forward to a bit more companionship come the end of the year when I'm finished with all of this. But I do like the feeling of getting into my little car knowing for the next couple of hours I'll have only the roads, the big gray sky, and my daydreams for company. And if I'm in a town somewhere with several minutes to kill, I'll enjoy myself wandering about looking in the shop windows. Here in my bedsit, I've got these 4 desk lamps, each a different color, but all the same design. They have these ribbed necks you can bend whichever way you want. So I might go looking for a shop with another lamp like that in its window, not to buy, but just to compare with my ones at home. Sometimes I get so immersed in my own company if I unexpectedly run into someone I know, it's a bit of a shock and takes me a while to adjust. That's the way it was the morning I was walking across the windswept car park of the service station and spotted Laura sitting behind the wheel of one of the parked cars looking vacantly towards the motorway. I was still some way away, and just for a second, even though we hadn't met since the cottages 7 years before, I was tempted to ignore her and keep walking. An odd reaction, I know, considering she'd been one of my closest friends. As I say, it may have been partly because I didn't like being bumped out of my daydreams. But also, I suppose, when I saw Laura slumped in her car like that, I saw immediately she'd become one of these carers I've just been describing, and a part of me just didn't want to find out much more about it. But of course I did go to her. There was a chilly wind blowing against me as I walked over to her hatchback parked away from the other vehicles. Laura was wearing a shapeless blue anorak, and her hira, a lot shorter than before, was sticking to her forehead. When I tapped on her window, she didn't start or even look surprised to see me after all that time. It was almost like she'd been sitting there waiting, if not for me precisely then, for someone more or less like me from the old days. And now I'd shown up, her first thought seemed to be at last. Because I could see her shoulders move in a kind of sigh. Then, without further ado, she reached over to open the door for me. We talked for about 20 minutes. I didn't leave until the last possible moment. A lot of it was about her, how exhausted she'd been, how difficult one of her donors was, how much she loathed this nurse or that doctor. I waited to see a flash of the old Laura with the mischievous grin and inevitable wisecrack, but none of that came. She talked faster than she used to, and although she seemed pleased to see me, I sometimes got the impression it wouldn't have mattered much if it wasn't me, but someone else, so long as she got to talk. Maybe we both felt there was something dangerous about bringing up the old days, because for ages we avoided any mention of them. In the end, though, we found ourselves talking about Ruth, who Laura had run into at a clinic a few years earlier, when Ruth was still a carer. I began quizzing her about how Ruth had been, but she was so unforthcoming. In the end, I said to her, "Look, you must have talked about something." Laura let out a long sigh. "You know how it gets," she said. We were both in a hurry. Then she added, "Anyway, we hadn't parted the best of friends back at the cottages. So maybe we weren't so delighted to see one another." "I didn't realize you'd fallen out with her too," I said. She shrugged. "It wasn't any big deal. You remember the way she was back then. If anything, after you left, she got worse. You know, always telling everyone what to do. So I was keeping out of her way, that was all. We never had a big fight or anything." "So you haven't seen her since then?" "No." "Funny, but I've never even glimpsed her." "Yeah, it's funny. You'd think we'd all run into each other much more. I've seen Hannah a few times. And Michael H., too." Then she said, "I heard this rumor that Ruth had a really bad first donation." "Just a rumor, but I heard it more than once." "I heard that too," I said. "Poor Ruth." We were quiet for a moment. Then Laura asked, "Is it right, Kathy, that they let you choose your donors now?" She'd not asked in the accusing way people do sometimes, so I nodded and said, "Not every time. But I did well with a few donors, so yeah, I get to have a say every now and then." "If you can choose," Laura said, "why don't you become Ruth's carer?" I shrugged. "I've thought about it, but I'm not sure it's such a great idea." Laura looked puzzled. But you and Ruth, you were so close. Yeah, I suppose so. But like with you, Laura, she and I weren't such great friends by the end. Oh, but that was back then. She's had a bad time. And I've heard she's had trouble with her carers, too. They've had to change them around a lot for her. Not surprising, really, I said. Can you imagine? Being Ruth's carer? Laura laughed, and for a second a look came into her eyes that made me think she was finally going to come out with a crack. But then the light died, and she just went on sitting there looking tired. We talked a little more about Laura's problems, in particular about a certain nursing sister who seemed to have it in for her. Then it was time for me to go, and I reached for the door and was telling her we'd have to talk more the next time we met. But we were both of us by then acutely aware of something we'd not yet mentioned, and I think we both sensed there'd be something wrong about us parting like that. In fact, I'm pretty sure now at that moment our minds were running along exactly the same lines. Then she said, "It's weird. Thinking it's all gone now." I turned in my seat to face her again. "Yeah, it's really strange," I said. "I can't really believe it's not there anymore." "It's so weird," Laura said. "I suppose it shouldn't make any difference to me now. But somehow it does." "I know what you mean." It was that exchange when we finally mentioned the closing of Hailsham that suddenly brought us close again, and we hugged quite spontaneously, not so much to comfort one another, but as a way of affirming Hailsham, the fact that it was still there in both our memories. Then I had to hurry off to my own car. I'd first started hearing rumors about Hailsham closing a year or so before that meeting with Laura in the car park. I'd be talking to a donor or a carer, and they'd bring it up in passing like they expected me to know all about it. "You were at Hailsham, weren't you? So, is it really true?" That sort of thing. Then one day I was coming out of a clinic in Suffolk and ran into Roger C., who'd been in the year below, and he told me with complete certainty it was about to happen. Hailsham was going to close any day, and there were plans to sell the house and grounds to a hotel chain. I remember my first response when he told me this. I said, "But what'll happen to all the students?" Roger obviously thought ID meant the ones still there, the little ones dependent on their guardians, and he put on a troubled face and began speculating how they'd have to be transferred to other houses around the country, even though some of these would be a far cry from Hailsham. But of course that wasn't what ID meant. ID meant us all. The students had grown up with me and were now spread across the country, carers and donors all separated now but still somehow linked by the place we'd come from. That same night, trying to get to sleep in an overnight, I kept thinking about something that had happened to me a few days earlier. I'd been in a seaside town in North Wales. It had been raining hard all morning, but after lunch it had stopped and the sun had come out a bit. I was walking back to where I'd left my car along one of those long, straight seafront roads. There was hardly anyone else about, so I could see an unbroken line of wet paving stones stretching on in front of me. Then, after a while, a van pulled up maybe 30 yards ahead of me, and a man got out dressed as a clown. He opened the back of the van and took out a bunch of helium balloons, about a dozen of them, and for a moment he was holding the balloons in one hand while he bent down and rummaged about in his vehicle with the other. As I came closer, I could see the balloons had faces and shaped ears, and they looked like a little tribe bobbing in the air above their owner, waiting for him. Then the clown straightened, closed up his van, and started walking in the same direction I was walking, several paces ahead of me, a small suitcase in one hand, the balloons in the other. The seafront continued long and straight, and I was walking behind him for what seemed like ages. Sometimes I felt awkward about it, and I even thought the clown might turn and say something. But since that was the way I had to go, there wasn't much else I could do. So we just kept walking, the clown and me on and on along the deserted pavement, still wet from the morning, and all the time the balloons were bumping and grinning down at me. Every so often I could see the man's fist where all the balloon strings converged, and I could see he had them securely twisted together and in a tight grip. Even so, I kept worrying that one of the strings would come unraveled and a single balloon would sail off up into that cloudy sky. Lying awake that night after what Roger had told me, I kept seeing those balloons again. I thought about Hailsham closing and how it was like someone coming along with a pair of shears and snipping the balloon strings, just where they entwined above the man's fist. Once that happened, there'd be no real sense in which those balloons belonged with each other anymore. When he was telling me the news about Hailsham, Roger had made a remark saying he supposed it wouldn't make so much difference to the likes of us anymore. And in certain ways, he might have been right. But it was unnerving to think things weren't still going on back there, just as always that people like Miss Geraldine say weren't leading groups of juniors around the north playing field. In the months after that talk with Roger, I kept thinking about it a lot, about Hailsham closing and all the implications. And it started to dawn on me, I suppose, that a lot of things I'd always assumed I'd plenty of time to get round to doing, I might now have to act on pretty soon, or else let them go forever. It's not that I started to panic exactly, but it definitely felt like Hailsham's going away had shifted everything around us. That's why what Laura said to me that day about my becoming Ruth's carer had such an impact on me, even though I'd stonewalled her at the time. It was almost like a part of me had already made that decision, and Laura's words had simply pulled away a veil that had been covering it over. I first turned up at Ruth's recovery center in Dover, the modern one with the white-tiled walls, just a few weeks after that talk with Laura. It had been around 2 months since Ruth's first donation, which, as Laura had said, hadn't gone at all well. When I came into her room, she was sitting on the edge of her bed in her nightdress and gave me a big smile. She got up to give me a hug, but almost immediately sat down again. She told me I was looking better than ever and that my hair suited me really well. I said nice things about her too, and for the next half hour or so, I think we were genuinely delighted to be with each other. We talked about all kinds of things: Hailsham, the cottages, what we'd been doing since then, and it felt like we could talk and talk forever. In other words, it was a really encouraging start, better than I'd dared expect. Even so, that first time we didn't say anything about the way we'd parted. Maybe if we'd tackled it at the start, things would have played out differently, who knows? As it was, we just skipped over it, and once we'd been talking for a while, it was as if we'd agreed to pretend none of that had ever happened. That may have been fine as far as that first meeting was concerned. But once I officially became her carer and I began to see her regularly, the sense of something not being right grew stronger and stronger. I developed a routine of coming in 3 or 4 times a week in the late afternoon with mineral water and a packet of her favorite biscuits, and it should have been wonderful, but at the beginning it was anything but that. We'd start talking about something completely innocent, and for no obvious reason, we'd come to a halt. Or if we did manage to keep up a conversation, the longer we went on, the more stilted and guarded it became. Then one afternoon I was coming down her corridor to see her and heard someone in the shower room opposite her door. I guessed it was Ruth in there, so I let myself into her room and was standing waiting for her, looking at the view from her window over all the rooftops. About 5 minutes passed, then she came in wrapped in a towel. Now, to be fair, she wasn't expecting me for another hour, and I suppose we all feel a bit vulnerable after a shower with just a towel on. Even so, the look of alarm that went across her face took me aback. I have to explain this a bit. Of course, I was expecting her to be a little surprised. But the thing was, after she'd taken it in and seen it was me, there was a clear second, maybe more, when she went on looking at me, if not with fear, then with a real wariness. It was like she'd been waiting and waiting for me to do something to her, and she thought the time had now come. The look was gone the next instant, and we just carried on as usual, but that incident gave us both a jolt. It made me realize Ruth didn't trust me, and for all I know, maybe she herself hadn't fully realized it until that moment. In any case, after that day, the atmosphere got even worse. It was like we'd let something out into the open, and far from clearing the air, it had made us more aware than ever of everything that had come between us. It got to the stage where, before I went in to see her, I'd sit in my car for several minutes working myself up for the ordeal. After one particular session, when we did all the checks on her in stony silence, then afterwards just sat there in more silence, I was about ready to report to them that it hadn't worked out, that I should stop being Ruth's carer. But then everything changed again, and that was because of the boat. God knows how these things work. Sometimes it's a particular joke, sometimes a rumor. It travels from center to center right the way across the country in a matter of days, and suddenly every donor's talking about it. Well, this time it was to do with this boat. ID first heard about it from a couple of my donors up in North Wales. Then a few days later, Ruth too started telling me about it. I was just relieved we'd found something to talk about and encouraged her to go on. This boy on the next floor, she said. His carer's actually been to see it. Welcome to Annie's story and adventure. Join Annie on a thrilling journey filled with captivating love stories, heartfelt experiences, and exciting adventures. Our channel blends vibrant life moments with the elegance of wine culture.